What happens when Hollywood's most iconic tough guy meets daytime television's most polarizing panel? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down with the View hosts in what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history. The tension was palpable from the moment the legendary actor stepped onto that stage, but nobody could have predicted the verbal warfare that was about to erupt. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these worlds collide in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The atmosphere in the View studio felt different that morning. There was an electric tension crackling through the air as crew members made their final preparations for what everyone assumed would be another standard celebrity interview. Clint Eastwood, the 94-year-old legend whose career spans over 6 decades, had agreed to appear on the show to discuss his latest directorial project. The man who had stared down countless villains on screen and behind the camera was about to face his most challenging audience. As the show's theme music faded and the cameras rolled live across the nation, the four hosts sat at their familiar table with their practiced smiles. But there was something sharp lurking beneath the surface. Whoopi Goldberg, serving as the show's moderator, introduced their guest with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. But those who knew the behind-the-scenes dynamics could sense the underlying current of anticipation for conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Clint Eastwood, Whoopi announced as the audience erupted in applause. The veteran actor emerged from backstage with his characteristic slow, measured walk, wearing a simple dark suit that somehow made him look both distinguished and slightly out of place in the bright, colorful studio setting. As Eastwood settled into the guest chair, adjusting his posture with the careful movements of a man his age, Joy Behar leaned forward with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Clint, it's wonderful to have you here. We've been looking forward to this conversation all week." "Thank you for having me," Eastwood replied in his unmistakable gravelly voice, his pale blue eyes scanning the panel with the same intensity he'd brought to countless film roles. There was something in his gaze that suggested he was already assessing the situation, reading the room like a seasoned poker player. The interview began innocuously enough, with standard questions about his latest film, his approach to directing at his age, and reflections on his legendary career. Eastwood answered with his typical economy of words, each response measured and deliberate. But as the minutes ticked by, it became increasingly clear that the hosts had a different agenda in mind. Sunny Hostin, who had been unusually quiet during the opening pleasantries, suddenly shifted in her seat and fixed Eastwood with a pointed stare. "Clint, I have to ask you about some of your past comments regarding certain political figures and social issues. Your support for various candidates over the years has been quite controversial." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his fingers drummed once against the arm of his chair. "I've always believed in speaking my mind," he said slowly. "That's what this country was built on." "But speaking your mind can have consequences," Sarah Haynes interjected, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Especially when you have a platform and influence over millions of people. Don't you think celebrities have a responsibility to be more careful with their words?" Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly, and those familiar with his work could recognize the expression from dozens of westerns where he'd faced down outlaws in dusty streets. "I think people have a responsibility to think for themselves rather than letting celebrities or talk show hosts tell them what to believe." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Joy Behar's smile faltered completely, and Whoopi shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The audience, sensing the shift in energy, had grown noticeably quieter. "That's an interesting perspective," Whoopi said, her voice taking on a more formal tone. "But surely you recognize that with great fame comes great responsibility. When you endorse certain viewpoints, especially ones that many people find divisive or harmful, you're contributing to the polarization of our society." Eastwood leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more stoic by the moment. "I've been making movies and expressing my opinions for longer than some of you have been alive. I've seen this country go through a lot of changes, and I've always believed that freedom of speech means protecting the speech you don't like, not just the speech you agree with." The hosts exchanged glances that viewers at home couldn't miss. There was something calculated about their coordination, as if they had rehearsed this confrontation. Sunny Hostin picked up the thread again, her prosecutor background evident in her aggressive questioning style. But freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences, she pressed. When you make statements that can be interpreted as supporting discrimination or prejudice, don't you think you have a moral obligation to clarify or apologize? Eastwood's weathered face hardened, and for a moment, he looked every bit the formidable figure who had dominated movie screens for decades. I don't apologize for having principles, and I don't apologize for standing by them even when they're unpopular. That's called integrity. The word integrity seemed to strike a nerve. Sarah Haynes leaned forward aggressively, her previous friendliness completely abandoned. Integrity? Is it integrity to support politicians who have been accused of various misconduct? Is it integrity to make comments that many people in marginalized communities find hurtful? Now hold on just a minute, Eastwood said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low register. The man who had made careers out of playing characters who didn't back down from a fight was clearly not about to start now. You're putting words in my mouth and attributing positions to me that I've never taken. This is exactly the kind of dishonest media manipulation that people are sick and tired of. The accusation of dishonesty hit the panel like a slap. Whoopi's eyebrows shot up, and Joy Behar's mouth fell open in apparent shock. The audience began to murmur, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Dishonest, Joy repeated, her voice rising with indignation. We're asking you legitimate questions about your public statements. If you can't handle being held accountable for your words, maybe you shouldn't be making them in the first place. Eastwood's hands gripped the arms of his chair, and his voice took on the steely quality that had made him famous. I can handle any question you want to throw at me, but I won't sit here and be lectured by people who twist facts to fit their narrative. You invited me here under false pretenses. The tension in the studio had become so thick, it was almost visible. Camera operators were adjusting their angles to capture every micro-expression, and the production team in the control room was undoubtedly having heated discussions about how to handle the rapidly deteriorating situation. Sunny Hostin, perhaps, sensing that they were losing control of the interview, decided to escalate further. False pretenses? We invited you here to have an honest conversation about your career and your impact on American culture. If you're uncomfortable with that level of scrutiny, then maybe you're not as confident in your positions as you claim to be. The challenge was unmistakable, and Eastwood's response was swift and cutting. Lady, I was having honest conversations about American culture before you were even born. I've earned the right to my opinions through decades of work and service to this country. I don't need validation from a television panel to know where I stand. The dismissive tone and the word lady clearly rankled Hostin, whose professional composure was beginning to crack. Age doesn't give you a free pass to say whatever you want without consequences. And your so-called service doesn't excuse promoting harmful ideologies. Harmful ideologies, Eastwood repeated, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. You want to talk about harmful ideologies? How about the ideology that says anyone who disagrees with your worldview is automatically a bigot or a criminal? How about the ideology that says free speech only applies to people who think the right thoughts? The words hung in the air like a challenge to a duel, and it was clear that both sides had crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. Whoopi Goldberg, who had been attempting to maintain some semblance of control over the rapidly disintegrating interview, finally abandoned her role as neutral moderator. Her face darkened with an expression that viewers had rarely seen during her tenure on the show. Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, you're sitting at this table making accusations about our integrity while defending positions that many Americans find deeply troubling. Deeply troubling to who? Eastwood shot back, his legendary composure finally cracking completely. To the coastal elites who think they speak for the entire country? To the media personalities who've never worked a real job or struggled to make ends meet? You're living in a bubble, and you think everyone who doesn't share your privileged perspective is some kind of villain. The accusation of living in a bubble struck home with devastating accuracy. Joy Behar's face flushed red, and she leaned forward with barely contained fury. Privileged? You're a millionaire Hollywood actor lecturing us about privilege? The hypocrisy is staggering. The difference is I never forgot where I came from, Eastwood replied, his voice now carrying the full weight of his decades in the spotlight. I never forgot what it was like to dig ditches and pump gas before I made it in this business. I never forgot that there are people out there who work two jobs just to keep their families fed while you sit here in your Manhattan studios pontificating about social justice. Sarah Haynes, who had been growing visibly agitated throughout the exchange, suddenly slammed her hand on the table with a sharp crack that echoed through the studio. That's enough. You don't get to come on our show and insult us personally while hiding behind some folksy everyman persona. Your politics have real consequences for real people. My politics? Eastwood's eyes flashed with genuine anger now. You mean my belief in individual responsibility? My belief that people should be judged by their character rather than their identity? My belief that this country's founding principles still matter? Those are the politics you find so offensive. The audience had gone completely silent now, mesmerized by the spectacle unfolding before them. This wasn't the usual political disagreement that viewers had come to expect from daytime television. This was something far more personal and visceral. Sunny Hostin, her legal training evident in her calculated approach, decided to go for what she clearly hoped would be a knockout blow. Mr. Eastwood, let's be specific. You've made statements supporting politicians who have been credibly accused of sexual misconduct. You've defended policies that disproportionately harm communities of color. You've used your platform to legitimize viewpoints that many Americans consider racist and sexist. How do you justify that? The studio fell into an almost supernatural quiet. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath as Eastwood slowly turned his gaze toward Hostin. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than if he had shouted. You just accused me of being a racist and a sexist on national television without a shred of evidence. You've taken my words out of context, twisted my positions, and now you're trying to destroy my reputation based on lies. That's not journalism. That's character assassination. We're not assassinating your character. Whoopi interjected desperately, perhaps sensing that the situation was spiraling completely out of control. We're trying to have an honest conversation about the impact of your words and actions. Honest, Eastwood laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. There's nothing honest about this ambush. You brought me here under the pretense of discussing my work, and instead you've turned it into a political inquisition. You've accused me of things I've never done and said things I've never said, all because I don't toe your ideological line. Joy Behar, who had been seething throughout the exchange, finally exploded with uncontrolled rage. We're not the ones who chose to make this political. You're the one who's been making controversial statements for years. You're the one who's been divisive. We're just holding you accountable. Accountable to who? Eastwood demanded, rising slightly in his chair with a physicality that reminded everyone present of his imposing screen presence. To you? To this network? To the mob that demands conformity from everyone in the public eye? I don't answer to any of you. The defiance in his voice was unmistakable, and it seemed to infuriate the hosts even further. Sarah Haynes pointed an accusatory finger across the table, her professional demeanor completely abandoned. That attitude right there is exactly the problem. You think you're above accountability because you're famous and successful, but fame doesn't give you the right to spread harmful messages. And who appointed you the arbiters of what messages are harmful? Eastwood countered, his voice rising. To match hers. Who gave you the authority to decide what Americans are allowed to think and say? You're not journalists. You're activists masquerading as news people. The accusation hit like a bombshell. Whoopi's mouth opened and closed without sound, while Joy Behar looked as if she'd been physically struck. The suggestion that they weren't legitimate journalists, but rather biased activists clearly touched the rawest of nerves. How dare you? Sunny Hostin hissed, her composure completely shattered. We've dedicated our careers to informing the public and fighting for justice. We've used our platform to give voice to the voiceless and hold powerful people accountable for their actions. What have you done besides make movies and spout off about politics you don't understand? Eastwood's face had gone stone cold, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had lived through decades of American history. What have I done? I've served my country in the military. I've created jobs for thousands of people. I've told stories that inspired generations of Americans. I've stood up for principles even when they were unpopular. And I've done it all without needing the approval of people who think they're morally superior to everyone else. The mention of military service seemed to strike another nerve with the panel. Sarah Haynes leaned forward aggressively, her voice dripping with disdain. Military service doesn't give you a free pass to promote discriminatory viewpoints. Plenty of veterans disagree with your politics. And plenty agree with them. Eastwood shot back immediately. But you don't invite those veterans on your show, do you? You only platform the ones who reinforce your narrative. That's not journalism. That's propaganda. The word propaganda seemed to be the final straw for Joy Behar, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the confrontation. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and pointed directly at Eastwood with shaking finger. I've had enough of this. You come on our show, insult our integrity, call us propagandists, and expect us to just sit here and take it? Who do you think you are? Eastwood looked up at her with the same steady gaze that had made him famous, completely unfazed by her theatrical outburst. I'm someone who's not afraid to tell the truth, even when it makes people uncomfortable. I'm someone who believes in America's founding principles, even when they're under attack. And I'm someone who won't be bullied by a panel of television personalities who think they speak for the entire country. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both sides now fully committed to a battle that neither seemed willing or able to back down from. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about moments in daytime television history. Whoopi Goldberg, perhaps sensing that the situation had spiraled far beyond anything they had anticipated, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Look, everyone needs to take a breath here. We're all adults. We can disagree without. Don't, Eastwood interrupted, his voice cutting through her words like a blade. Don't you dare try to play peacemaker now after you've spent the last 20 minutes attacking my character and my beliefs. You wanted this fight, and now you're going to see it through to the end. Sunny Hostin, emboldened by what she perceived as Eastwood's defensiveness, pressed her advantage with prosecutorial precision. The fact that you're getting so emotional about this tells us everything we need to know. If you were confident in your positions, you wouldn't be so angry about being questioned. Eastwood's laugh was sharp and bitter. Emotional? Lady, you haven't seen me emotional yet. What you're seeing is disgust. Disgust at what passes for journalism these days. Disgust at the way you've turned this interview into a kangaroo court. And disgust at the realization that this is what American discourse has become. Sarah Haynes, who had been practically vibrating with indignation throughout the exchange, finally erupted with uncontrolled fury. American discourse? You want to talk about American discourse? How about the discourse you've contributed to by supporting divisive figures and making inflammatory statements? How about taking responsibility for your own part in the toxicity? My part in the toxicity. Eastwood's voice rose to a level that seemed to shake the studio walls. I've spent my entire career trying to tell stories about honor, courage, and redemption. I've portrayed characters who stood up for what was right even when it was difficult. And now I'm being lectured about toxicity by people who make their living by creating conflict and division for television ratings. The accusation that they were manufacturing conflict for ratings hit home with devastating accuracy. Joy Behar's face went white with rage, and she began gesturing wildly as she spoke. We don't manufacture anything. We respond to the things public figures say and do. If you don't like being held accountable, then maybe you should think twice before opening your mouth. Held accountable by who? Eastwood demanded, now fully on his feet despite his age, towering over the seated panel. With an intimidating presence that reminded everyone why he had been such a commanding figure on screen. By you? By this network? By the media establishment that's decided anyone who doesn't conform to your worldview is automatically evil. The studio had fallen into an eerie quiet, with only the hum of camera equipment and the distant sound of traffic outside breaking the silence. Even the production crew seemed frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or let the confrontation play out to its inevitable conclusion. Whoopi made one final attempt to salvage the situation, her voice taking on a pleading quality. Clint, nobody's calling you evil. We're just trying to understand how someone with your influence can stop, Eastwood said, holding up a hand with such authority that Whoopi immediately fell silent. Just stop. I've heard enough. You've made your position clear, and I've made mine clear. The difference is I'm not trying to destroy your livelihood or your reputation because we disagree. Sonny Hostin, perhaps sensing that Eastwood was preparing to leave, made one last desperate grab for the moral high ground. Mr. Eastwood, if you walk away from this conversation, you're proving that you can't handle being challenged on your beliefs. Is that really the legacy you want to leave? Eastwood turned to face her directly, and the look in his eyes was colder than any of his most memorable film performances. My legacy? I've been making movies for over 60 years. I've directed films that will be watched long after this show is forgotten. I've created characters that have inspired millions of people around the world. My legacy is secure, and it doesn't need the approval of a television panel to validate it. Joy Behar, who had been growing increasingly agitated as it became clear that Eastwood was not going to be intimidated or shamed into submission, made one final, desperate attack. Those movies don't erase the harmful things you've said and done. Art doesn't give you a free pass to promote dangerous ideologies. The word dangerous seemed to be the final straw for Eastwood. His jaw clenched, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his legendary screen presence. Dangerous ideologies? You want to know what's dangerous? What's dangerous is a media culture that demands absolute conformity. What's dangerous is the idea that anyone who disagrees with the prevailing narrative should be silenced or destroyed. What's dangerous is people like you who think you have the moral authority to judge everyone else. Sarah Haynes shot to her feet, pointing an accusatory finger across the table. We're not trying to silence anyone. We're trying to hold people accountable for the consequences of their words and actions. No, Eastwood said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than if he had shouted. You're trying to intimidate me into apologizing for beliefs I'll never apologize for. You're trying to make me bow down to your ideology, and that's never going to happen. The finality in his voice was unmistakable. He reached down and unclipped the small microphone from his jacket lapel, the tiny gesture somehow carrying enormous symbolic weight. The sound of the mic hitting the table echoed through the silent studio like a gunshot. This interview is over, Eastwood declared, his words carrying the authority of a man who had commanded respect for decades. I came here in good faith to discuss my work, and instead I was subjected to a political ambush designed to embarrass and discredit me. I won't dignify this charade with another moment of my time. Whoopi made one last desperate plea as Eastwood began to move toward the exit. Clint, please, don't leave like this. We can find common ground if we just common ground. Eastwood paused and turned back to face the panel one final time. There is no common ground with people who think disagreement equals hatred. There's no common ground with people who believe they have the right to destroy anyone who doesn't share their worldview. You've shown me exactly who you are today, and I believe you. The reference to Maya Angelou's famous quote seemed to sting the hosts more than any direct insult could have. Joy Behar's mouth opened and closed without sound, while Sonny Hostin looked as if she had been physically slapped. You're running away, Sarah Haynes called out desperately as Eastwood continued toward the exit. You're proving that you can't defend your positions when you're actually challenged. Eastwood stopped dead in his tracks and slowly turned around one final time. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet intensity that had made him one of cinema's most memorable tough guys. I'm not running from anything. I'm walking away from people who have no interest in honest dialogue. I'm walking away from a media culture that's more interested in creating conflict than seeking truth. And I'm walking away from this circus with my dignity intact. Without another word, the legendary actor turned and walked toward the studio exit with the same measured pace that had characterized his entrance. His departure was unhurried but final, each step carrying the weight of a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed. The host sat in stunned silence as Eastwood disappeared through the studio doors, leaving behind a scene of chaos and confusion. The audience remained frozen, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in shocked silence at what they had witnessed. As the studio lights continued to blaze and the cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of the aftermath. It was clear that something unprecedented had just occurred. The confrontation had escalated beyond anyone's expectations, resulting in one of the most dramatic walkouts in television history. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant sound of a car door slamming in the parking lot outside. Clint Eastwood had left the building, taking with him any chance of resolution or reconciliation. The View hosts were left to face the cameras and their audience, knowing that they had just been part of a television moment that would be discussed